Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Steve, obviously, for organising this event and giving us the opportunity to speak to everybody today. Certainly a subject that is becoming more prominent, hence, I think, there's more people in the room than there was last year and possibly the year before as well. So it's very heartening to see that this is something that's becoming more commonplace. We have quite an impressive panel here this morning, so I'm going to let them do most of the talking. But just to introduce myself properly, I'm Holly Price. I'm the Sustainability Director for Keltbray. For those of you that don't know us, we're a major demolition civil engineering contractor, very prominent projects here in London and the rest of the UK. Mustn't forget about those as well. My background, I've been with Keltbray for 19 years now. I can't quite believe it myself. And I'm also past president of the NFDC that Howard told me I had to say when we came in this morning. So in my former life, however, I did 10 years and I worked as an explosives engineer in demolition. Not a technique that particularly lends itself to reuse of materials, I hasten to add, hence my move into the sustainability realm with a focus on needing to do something a little bit different. And so that's been my focus for the last almost 20 years. So thank you for having me, and I'm going to pass you on to the panel to introduce yourselves, if I may.
Thank you, Holly. My name is Christian van Maaren. I'm the CEO and founder of the Excess Materials Exchange, which we describe, as Steve already said in his intro, a dating site for secondary materials and waste. And of course, steel, seeing that we do a lot of work in the built environment, is a big element of that. So very happy to be here.
Thank you. Katherine?
Thanks, Holly. Blowing up buildings, though, that does sound quite fun, if fun is the right word. Anyway, I'm Katherine Adams. I'm Technical Director at the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. So we're a membership-based organisation of about 150 members across the supply chain. We're doing quite a lot on steel reuse. We've had a Disrupt project that ran last year. We've got Disrupt 2 running now, which is all working very closely with the demolition industry, and I'll talk a bit about what we've found out later.
Thank you. Andy?
Hi, I'm Andy Yates. I'm a founder member for the Engineers Reuse Collective. So we're a fairly new group of structural engineers who've come together to champion, accelerate and deliver on the reuse of materials, particularly focusing on the design of project cycles.
Thank you. So?
Hi, I'm Simon Bennett. I'm Associate Director at Civic Engineers. We're a civil and structural engineering design consultancy, and I have had the pleasure of working on 318 Oxford Street, the old House of Fraser building on Oxford Street for the last 6 years, where we have managed to reuse some of the columns that we've demolished from parts of the structure in new bits of the structure, and we've also worked with Webb Yates, who, yes, Andy is the Yates of Webb Yates, to get some of the beams from 318 Oxford Street reused for partnerships TBC project at Tower Bridge. So through that process, I've become quite passionate about steel reuse particularly and reuse generally. So that's the context in which I'm speaking to you.
Thank you very much. So this first session, we're going to really talk about meeting the demand and hopefully the merits of deconstruction as opposed to traditional demolition. But I think it's important that we acknowledge the challenges that poses as well, quite honestly. And then certainly I'm very interested to hear about some of the other feedback, because of course my experience is within Keltbray, but of course I'd love to hear about particularly the challenges that other people are having in this space as well. I think pipeline is also something we'd like to touch on this morning, if at all humanly possible, but we will talk also hopefully about when it becomes inefficient to reuse steel this morning too, because I think it is important that we know that is something that needs to be considered. We're also going to avoid the testing element, given that there is quite a long session on it this afternoon, so we certainly don't want to steal anybody's thunder in that respect. So if I could, I've got some questions prepared for our panel here, but if I could also ask everybody to join the Slido, and if you do have questions for the panel, please do pop them in the chat, and we'll have a few questions to get the conversation flowing, and then and then they can blame somebody other than me for the hard ones that are going to come a little bit later. But I think, first of all, Andy, you mentioned to me all of the weird and wonderful things that you are doing this morning. Can you tell me a little bit more about the Engineers Reuse Collective, please?
Yes. So we're set up as a not-for-profit organisation. It's a group of structural engineers who come together in some ways to build on the things which Civic and Yates did with the project which Simon's been talking about. But our overall aim is to tackle some of the barriers to reuse, particularly in earlier project stages, to ensure that reuse strategies get incorporated into projects and engineers are empowered to push and promote for greater reuse. We're set up to build on the Engineers Declared pledges, which a lot of companies have signed up to. And what we want is we want engineers to be confident to be able to push for reuse strategies. So we hold meetings and technical forums with our members to discuss projects. But one important point on that is we don't just talk about success stories. I think it's very easy to publicise success. We talk about what hasn't worked, what's gone wrong, when we haven't been able to incorporate reuse. And by doing that, we can share experiences and knowledge so that engineers get greater confidence, I suppose, to talk to use it then outside on their projects. So that's where we are. We're hoping to do.
Thank you. No, it's really interesting. And I think certainly looking at the design stages is obviously critical to the success of whether we can or can't do this kind of work. And Katherine, if I may come to you next, if that's okay. You've been working with a group of demolition contractors, I believe, in a working group capacity to talk about the challenges that they're facing. Could you highlight some of the main issues that are coming up or key challenges there?
Yeah, sure. So as part of Disrupt 2, we're working with IDE, which is the Institute of Demolition Engineers, and Howard Button. Did he give us away? Oh, there he is, right in the front. Who's got so much experience, 50 plus years, is it? Wish I had more experience on slide. So with Howard's involvement, it's been really great because we've been able to set up a really good group of demolition contractors. A wide range as well, so some of the bigger ones, some of the smaller ones, some in London, but some elsewhere in the country where steel reuse isn't so necessarily happening so much. And a few challenges really. You've got it's the understanding of the equipment that's needed, and we're trying to sort of disprove that it may be more hassle, and sometimes it is, that's honest, but sometimes it isn't. You can use what you've already got. There's the timing implications and the cost implications, and as you said at the beginning as well, just understanding when it is worth recovering that steel for reuse versus just sending it for scrap. So really sort of digging down into those issues isn't easy, especially with some of the contractors who haven't done it. It can be can be a little bit difficult to persuade them to change their mindsets, but we're trying to produce guidance which sort of tries to answer their questions, I guess.
Thank you, Katherine. No, that is helpful. It was interesting. We did a presentation at the European Demolition Association about 5 or 6 years ago, and we started talking about decommissioning and dismantling rather than demolition. And I can honestly say people were looking at us like we had two heads at the time. So things have moved on quite quickly, which is very positive. But of course, Simon, you've had some very recent experience that you've already mentioned, 318 Oxford Street. Could you tell us a little bit more about how the reuse came to be on that project, what the decision-making process was?
Well, the genesis of that idea came back in 2018, 2019, so before any of the SCI guidance was published. And actually what sparked it in my mind was a comment from the agents. The building was built as a department store. It's being refurbished as a mixed-use office-led development with a signature restaurant on the top floor. This is a wonderful picture of it being built in about 1936. And what you can probably just about see there is that the top 2 floors have very, very mean floor-to-ceiling heights. So the scheme takes those off and puts 3 stories back on. And the agent said, well, this top floor restaurant it's going to be amazing. Obviously, it'll have amazing views. But yeah, it could be just another glass box on the top of a building in London. What can be done to give it some character and give it some sense of the building that it's on? And that's what sparked the idea in my mind for reusing some of the columns that we're taking out of those top 2 floors, some of the double story height columns, which we can cut down to give us the generous 1 story height columns that we need. That got approval from the client, and it's what we're doing. But of course, that left us with quite a lot of steel left over. And so one of my colleagues mentioned this on a bike ride with Basil de Marutis of 4 Partnership, and he said, well, we'll have it. And that has happened with the help of Webb Yates. They took about 45, well, they reused about 45 tons of our steel on their site. I suppose it has to be said that the majority of the material that came off this site has gone for scrap. And I think if we were starting now rather than 6 years ago, I think we might be more ambitious. But we were keen to make something happen and show that it was possible. And it's interesting that the steel that went from here to TBC must be some of the first steel to go through the SCI Protocol 440 for the reuse of pre-1970s steel, because that happened early in 2023. And it's been great. We haven't got the reuse columns erected yet, but you can bet they'll be on LinkedIn when we do.
Thank you. And Christian, if I may come to yourself, obviously excess materials exchange. Could you tell me a little bit more about that, please?
Absolutely. Yeah, so the EME, like I said, we describe it as a dating site for secondary materials and waste. And what we do is that we map material streams using resources passports, which are becoming somewhat of a household name now in the built environment. Also, I think the EU is driving some of that across the channel. Then we enable tracking and tracing, so you can follow these materials as they travel through the value chain. And then we use, and these are all buzzwords, but we use AI and machine learning to then help or assist us in finding high-value next uses for that. And on the steel part, actually, we did an interesting project as part of an EU-funded program at Oslo Airport, where a part of a gate was disassembled, and we went in. We did a pre-dismantling audit, as I would like to call it. We tagged everything, low tech, which is QR codes, and this meant that everyone who would walk by there and had a device could just scan it, go to the passport environments of our platform, see what they were looking at, and know what they had to do with it. And that actually led to an 80% reuse of all the different elements of that part of the gate, which to be honest, is extraordinary. We've never seen anything quite like it. Typically, it's more around maybe 5, 10, maybe 15%. And the benefits there, of course, was that it was EU funded, so there was not really a cost pressure. It was all organized within the airport ecosystem. So I think the overall ecosystem is fairly well organized, although it can get quite messy at airports as well. But they really liked it, the fact that they had access to all the information, everyone who was there, no material got lost. There was no one walking past a pile of materials and was like, what is all that? And just threw it in a skip and then it would get lost. I'm sure some of it happened, but the leakage rate was very low. So that's what we do with our platform and try to do loads more. We've been around for 7 years. We celebrated our 7-year anniversary just before the weekend. And we opened up an office here in the UK beginning of this year. So we're now expanding quite rapidly here as well.
That's fantastic. And I've got another couple of follow-up questions, if I may. We have, you mentioned about identifying what could be reused. What was the what were you looking for? What were the parameters? How do we know whether something can be put back into the reuse market?
Well, there's a couple of things to look at. I think first of all, you have to make sure that you can actually get it out in one piece, or at least in a reusable state, or at least in a usable state again. And then, of course, you have to have some confidence that you can retrieve some of the information about these assets. If you have a building from 1936, I'm pretty sure it's going to be quite difficult to get the information of the different elements that you're looking at. But if the building at Oslo Airport, for example, was I think 12 years old, it shouldn't have. It was a shame that it had to be taken down. Mm. But because of that, it was all bolted, so we could actually get it out quite easily, or they could get it out quite easily, and the information was still in a pretty good format. And then, and that's I think where this panel is all about, there needs to be a demand.
Absolutely.
Because I think what we see, of course, is that in the last couple of years, the circular economy transition has mostly been a supply-driven transition where companies would come to us and say, oh, I got this stuff, can you please find a better use for it than just throwing it away? But more and more, we're seeing that people are asking for stuff right now, and that's really interesting. That's a very interesting space to be in. But then you run into a lot of the issues, I think, that have been discussed before, is that when someone is designing a building, you have to really keep in mind that you're going to be using used elements in there, but you may only start building this 2 years, maybe 3 years from now. You don't really have the approvals yet, so how do you secure that demand? And that's an ongoing challenge that we're looking at also in the platform to be able to facilitate that, because I think that's key in an effective way, bringing together supply and demand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is one of the, I think Katherine, possibly you might have something to comment on this as well. I think that is one of the biggest challenges when a contractor like ourselves is asked to make sure that we're putting everything back into the marketplace, that actually, how do we find the person that needs it? How do we find the next project that it can go to? And we've got some great examples, and there's some around the room and out there where we've managed to do that, but it certainly wasn't something that we did alone. It has to be done with our customers, with the designers, with everybody else that's in that process as well. And I think, and I guess, Katherine, you've had similar feedback from some of the contractors too.
Yeah, and I think obviously contractors have their own networks. I think it does need to become a lot more formalised. A lot of it is still word of mouth, if you like, and little email groups and those sorts of things. I think for steel reuse, we're obviously fortunate in that we've got stockholders who want to buy the steel, so that makes it a little bit different. It's a commodity product, but I also think it's important to work a lot more with clients. So pre-demolition audits, they're a bit too late in the process, really, quite often. And it's just having a better understanding of your assets, what is going to come up for refurbishment and demolition, and understand it at that point, and then map that all in within your whole sort of portfolio asset management. And we've been trying to do that with a few clients, but it is really difficult. They all work on different timescales, different project teams. They're not all necessarily bought in. And so a lot of that just comes down to sort of people. It always comes down to people at the end of the day.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things that we're also trying to help with, and trying to get engineers to talk to each other about which projects are actually happening earlier on, so that trying to formalise it, but also it is so difficult. But just getting people to be talking to each other about what projects are happening, and awareness of other big projects which may be coming up and things. It's all part of getting people to talk, really.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense also the demolition contractor needs to be got on board way earlier in advance. Like we did a project here in the city where I think we did the pre-demolition audits maybe 2 years ago or a year and a half ago or something, and then the demolition contractor was onboarded maybe half a year ago, and all of a sudden, very quickly, you have to find solutions for these materials where we already mapped them out so long ago, where if they were onboarded at that time as well, I think you would have been able to do a lot more. So it's all about having this conversation, having the conversations very early on.
And I think if it's okay if I may to just add a comment there as well, as a contractor, when we're not engaged quite early enough, the competitive tendering situation becomes really tough, because under some of my competitors, peers, are in the room, and I'm sure hopefully that they would agree that actually we're not quite sure if we're on a level playing field. We're not quite sure whether if if I can be so bold to say, is our customers always know what they're asking us for, and so we have to put our best foot forward, of course. But it becomes very tricky, and yeah, I'm sure we can have a conversation around that later on. But it can be quite tough in that sense for the contractor, as you say, when we're engaged a little bit later in the process, because we do often find that we are asked as part of the demolition phase to do a pre-demolition audit. So absolutely, as you say, we're a little bit late in the game really when it comes to that. And so I was wondering, hopefully I didn't put my watch on this morning, so I've no idea what time it is. So Steve, if you need to yell at me, please do. But I just wondered if we have any questions from the floor. I think there's both a roving mic and hopefully we've got a couple of bits on Slido. I don't know if anybody can share that on the screen for us. No questions? Oh, there we go. There's some hands. I don't know which one went up first. They're both very quick off the mark there. There's a microphone working its way to the front, I think. If you could please say who you want to ask the question to, or if it's the whole panel as well, that would be helpful. This gentleman right here.
Okay, thank you. I'm Chris Smith. I'm a Senior Development Manager at Related Argent. We're a property developer doing large-scale regeneration schemes, and the one we're particularly involved with at the moment is the Brent Cross Town project up on just inside the North Circular in North London. A really key issue in the gestation of any design project is the point where you make the materiality choice. And we're right at that, on a set of projects at the moment, we're right on that cusp. And a key challenge is understanding at that decision point what the commercial position is likely to be, what the supply chain position is likely to be, what the availability of resource is likely to be. And all of those things affect that decision point. And of course, anything where there is risk on any one of those items tends to cause client bodies to defer back to the old tried and tested ways, which are we need to abandon. I've just read Hope in Hell by Jonathan Porritt. I commend it to everyone to read. It is a real wake-up call for what we need to do. I'd just like the panel to comment on that material choice point and how we make that the right decision in that journey.
You. Was there anybody?
Shall I as a practicing designer, that material choice has always been a big point in the project, whether you're thinking about reusing steel or reusing anything else. And my view has always been that the important thing with a design is to design efficiently. And sometimes that pushes you towards steel, sometimes it pushes you away from steel towards concrete or hopefully timber. But ultimately trying to force something which is most efficiently done in steel into a concrete project, or a project which is most efficiently done in concrete to be a steel project, in my opinion, is usually not the right course of action. And we've discussed, or Steve mentioned at the beginning, that it's important that where we do reuse steel, and reusing steel is really important, as I said, I'm quite passionate about it, but where we do it efficiently. So I think, in a sense, steel reuse needn't control that decision on materials, because if you've got a building and the most efficient answer for that building is a steel frame, then it makes sense to do it as a steel frame rather than force it to be something else. And if you can then efficiently reuse steel in that project, that's great. If, when you come to the higher detail, you can't efficiently reuse steel, then don't. You can think about trying to use, as Steve showed on that first slide, lower embodied carbon steels, but fundamentally do it efficiently. And if you can't reuse steel efficiently, leave it for somebody else to use efficiently, because there's never going to be, well, there certainly isn't enough reused steel in the supply chain at the moment to provide all the steel we need. And I don't think there ever will be. but I may be wrong about that. You may have different views, but there definitely isn't at the moment. So at the moment, I would say design your building efficiently. Reuse steel if it's efficient to use. If it's efficient for it to be a steel building, do it in steel. And if you can, use reuse steel. But if you can't, don't beat yourself up about it because somebody else will use that steel. That's my view. I don't know whether anyone else disagrees. Maybe slightly
maybe
controversial thing to say at a steel reuse conference.
Maybe to underpin one of these statements, I read a report a couple of years ago, it was done in Germany, I think, where they said that if all materials from the built environment was going to be used, so everything from demolition was going to be used for the new build, you would still need 90% virgin materials. Mm-hmm. So just, so to your point, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There was another hand up in the audience, I think. Yes, this lady here, if we could possibly get the mic. And then I will go to the screen, I promise.
Hi, I'm Sally Walsh from WSP. Question for Simon. Sorry. Why columns only did you choose to reuse?
This was, as I say, this was 6 years ago, and I think we would be more ambitious now. It was because we were going to. It was easy, basically. We were going to get double-story height columns out, which were therefore easily big enough to give us single-story, generous story height columns. The beams were harder to see how you could use because a lot of them are built up sections. So you have a rolled section with plates riveted on top. And in fact, most of them, the plates riveted on top, it varies along the length of the beam. So at the ends of the beam, you don't have anything. Then you have one plate, and then you have two, and then in the middle you have 3 plates built up. So the top of the beam is jagged. It's got rivets sticking out of it. And I have yet to work out how you land a composite metal deck slab on that, which is kind of the obvious thing to do with a steel frame these days. I think quite a lot of the beams had shelf angles riveted to the side of them, which support the current precast concrete floor, which was itself quite innovative in its day. And maybe we could have landed some decking on that, although I'm not sure. And the other thing is, if you just, and we might come onto this, but if you demolish beams by traditional means, you do an angle cut at the ends and lift them out, at which point they're not as long as they were when they started, which isn't necessarily a problem. We had spans of 7.5 to 10 metres, so you get reasonably long beams out. But they're obviously not long enough to put back into the same building with the same grid because you've cut the ends off. Again, that made it more difficult. But I kind of accept that if we were starting again today, we might try harder, to be honest. But back in 2018, some people did look at me like I was a bit weird.
Yeah, we've all had those stares, haven't we, I think, at some point or another.
Happens to me more than most, I think.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Thank you. Great question. Hi, can we get the microphone forward, please?
Hi, my name is Juliana Berglund Brown, and I'm a PhD student at MIT, coming from the States. I'm curious about how you define or quantify demand, and if it's on the elemental level, where you, which relates a bit to efficiency in terms of what you're talking about. And this is for the whole panel. And then to your point, also, how do you define what reusing steel efficiently means?
I think a lot of engineering is art and not just science. There's a lot of people who think that engineers sit in offices doing lots and lots of calculations, and we do calculations, but there's a lot more to it than that. And so a lot of it is judgment. But in a modern steel frame, you will probably be working most of the members certainly columns, but you'll be working most of the members at 90% of their capacity or more in the design. And that's right, because you don't want to be profligate with the use of material. And so there's no reason why you shouldn't be doing the same with reused steel. Obviously the capacity is often a little bit lower because the steel's not as high grade as we work with today, or it depends how old the steel is, but certainly 1930s steel is not as strong as steel today. But that doesn't mean you can't work it reasonably hard. And the columns at Oxford Street are working pretty hard. Having had the idea, I then had to make it work, that was a slightly interesting moment when I was doing some calculations. But it does work. So I think it's partly about literally the utilisation in the calculations, but it's also about just judgment. Is this a straightforward thing to build? Because if it isn't, if it's complicated and you've got to hang this bit off there and it's all kind of like this, it's probably not an efficient structure. And obviously the other aspect to it, which is less easy to control in design unless you're reusing your own steel, is how much wastage you create. So if you've got a 6 metre long member and you want a 3.5 metre long member, then probably 2.5 metres of it is going to go for scrap. And it might be better, even if you're working that thing that you're left with at 99%, it might be better to leave that bit of reused steel for somebody else who can use 5.5 metres of it and just send a little bit to scrap. So it's a difficult balance, and it needs judgment and thought and care and debate within the design team. And it's not just about calculations. Some of it is judgment.
Thank you, Simon. I think you copped for a few there, didn't you, on the bars? If I may, just because, again, Steve, somebody tell me when we've got a few minutes left, if that's okay. I will come to the questions on the board because they are flying in now. We were quiet at first. I think perhaps just very conscious again that the next session is about writing the brief, and the one immediately after is about buying the stock. So if we don't get through all these questions, forgive me, but I'm pretty sure they're going to be picked up on the next sessions, and I don't want to steal their thunder either. However, there's one very popular one at the top there. So plenty of demand for reclaimed beams exist. What can developers, designers, contractors do to increase the amount of steel actually being extracted? Is there anybody that would like to pick that?
Yeah, I can go for that. So that's something that we've been looking at quite a lot, and I think there's two models here really. It's where the client is wanting it and asking for it. That's an easier model if you like, but the demo contractor needs to understand what steel's in there, have a good idea, and there needs to be quite a sort of open discussion really on the sort of timescales of that and the equipment needed. Will that prolong the timescale? Doesn't need to necessarily. So we went to a John F. Hunt site to do some sort of time motion studies, looking at the different equipment needed. And I think it increased it by about 5 minutes per beam. So that, not a huge amount at all. But then you've got the other situation where if you haven't really got a client demanding it, it can be really tricky for the demolition contractor to do it. They get a good price for scrap. There's a cash flow issue. We were told the other day that, if I go and send my skip of scrapping, I'll get paid within 2 hours.
Yeah. That's
scrap price. So cash flow, that's a win there. It may take a lot longer to be paid for the reclaimed steel. And to question whether the uplift is enough either, especially if you're on projects which may not necessarily have the equipment in anyway. So I think there needs to be a real sort of better understanding of sort of, and an open sort of discussion really about those implications on programme, cost, equipment needs, and health and safety. Health and safety needs to be utmost as well when we're taking down some of these buildings.
But I think in the end, it's also important for all these people to just sit around the same table and talk to each other, because I think that's not happening a lot these days yet.
Starting to, but it's slow, isn't it?
Well, today is a wonderful example, of course, of that.
Yes.
So thank you again, Steve. So is there any competition for reused steel? I think the answer is very simply yes. At the moment, there is. I think it is a very popular concept, of course, something that is possibly slightly easier as well, if I can be so bold, rather than some of the other materials that we're extracting. So, but does anybody else want to add anything to that?
Well, I think in the end, the choice for reuse steel, also was what Katherine was saying, is mostly not a cost thing yet. I mean, until it maybe gets more commoditized, it's really about, you know, meeting certain sustainability targets or a client that wants it. So I don't know if, you know, if we can really talk about real competition yet. I mean, it's a very niche market that's still, you know, that's in a very nascent stage, which will grow, and then we can have discussions about, you know, what does it compete with and how does it all work.
Yeah.
I mean, at the moment, it's easier, sorry to say, to send it to EAF as scrap, as we all know. So it's sort of really understanding what is worth recovering. I think that's really important.
It's really important just to encourage everyone to bring it up the agenda. I've done various CPDs to various organisations, and at the end, I'm always like, right, so what does this mean for you? And if you're a QS, it's like, you know, ask your clients if that's what they want to do. If you're a contractor, ask your demolition partners about it. You know, just bring it up the agenda, and I think a market will develop. As you say, it's too young at the moment. You know, doing a deal on a bike ride, as happened at Oxford Street, is not the model for the future. But it does show that it's possible. So, you know, we're at the beginning.
Of course. Thank you. And then we have another one that's got lots of likes. In theory, does steel have an infinite lifespan?
Yes.
Yes. That was a simple answer, wasn't it? Does anybody want to add to that? I guess reusing the steel as is, potentially not, though?
I don't see why not. I think you should aspire. It can be reused and reused and reused, and you should always be aiming to reuse it as many times as you can.
There we go.
Sorry,
There's
my
the
view
answer.
is quite simple.
Absolutely, no.
And look after your building so that the steel doesn't get rusty.
Yes.
There's a famous example, isn't it, the Amsterdam Schiphol airport, where it's been reused. Is it 3 or 4 times the reuse of the steel?
In that bus terminal.
Yeah, for the bus terminal, yeah.
Well, I mean, we have one of the project managers here in the room, right? That's done it.
There you go.
Fantastic. And then we have, what regulation do you see influencing in the near to medium term? I know I'm certainly seeing some interesting things happening. I haven't read it yet. It's about 400 pages, I believe. Somebody sent me the new ISO standard for circular economies the other day. I mean, who knew that was a thing? Not me. So we need to take a look at that. But there's also been some really interesting conversations with the Greater London Authority recently about hierarchy and what we can and cannot do as far as getting permission to demolish in the first place. So that's certainly some interesting things happening there. But has anybody else got any comments?
Yeah, I work quite a bit with government through the Green Construction Board. Near term, nothing I can see happening near term. Medium term, that you know, the government is looking at whole life carbon, embodied carbon, where that comes into fruition of regulation to be determined. They are working on I think they're calling a zero waste economy strategy as well. There's quite a lot coming in from Europe. Whether that lands here as well will be interesting or not. And you've got influencing like the EU taxonomy and that sort of thing, which is really sort of upping the ante for circularity. It's different things happening, but I'm not uncertain to see how they're going to land.
I would say the biggest power of governments anywhere in the near term to influence circular economy and circular steel is through procurement. Just when they build something, ask for, you know, having circular elements in there. I think that's just the fastest way to getting this market going, really.
The other thing is City of London now requires circular economy statements for major planning applications, which is a good step forward. And my suspicion is that other central London councils will probably follow suit. Yeah.
I mean, that's been a huge growth, I think, for EME, but I think as well as for your work, Katherine, we've been getting lots of demand because on the back of that, so it's been great.
Yeah.
I would say, in some ways, the UK is now moving faster when it comes to adopting circular economy principles in the built environment than Europe and then the Netherlands.
Yeah, I think the challenge is taking it outside London, isn't it?
Sure.
I have a question here, because I did notice, Christian, obviously you work very internationally. I think you had a call with Australia the other day, I saw,
Sure.
and I thought I really meant to ask that actually. How are we doing as far as with the UK, of course, as far as talking about this? You've just begun to answer that question.
I mean,
But
I would say, that's maybe the bit of the silver lining of Brexit, is that in this very narrow niche of what we're doing, I do think that the UK is now moving faster than the continent. I mean, the Netherlands, of course, has done some great stuff, and I think it's become somewhat of a household thing now. I think it's almost the norm. But I think the UK government has taken some bold steps. For example, especially here in London, through the Circular Economy Statement, that's now a requirement. And because maybe things are not as cumbersome as the EU anymore, some things go a bit faster. It's my sort of opinion outside looking in some ways.
Thank you for that. And I'm wondering, I see another one for Simon, very popular this morning. Do you think the carbon agenda is impacting or influencing your point about the choice of best structural material for the project?
I think it does sometimes in a good way. But it comes back to the point that Steve made right at the beginning. We need to avoid the sort of clients just wanting to do virtue signalling and say, oh, we've reused steel or whatever, if that's very inefficient. So it's incumbent on all of us, particularly designers at early stages, to help educate clients, talk them through the options, and think holistically about what the impact of what we're proposing is. It's very tricky because there are lots and lots of accreditations out there, WELL, BREEAM, etc., and they're good because they do drive some change in the industry, but at the same time they don't cover everything. So you have to be careful that the tail doesn't wag the dog. But absolutely, people are thinking about the carbon agenda and trying to produce buildings which are better, and certainly in London, probably not true outside London, I don't have so much experience, but certainly in London I think there is a premium for buildings that have good credentials. I think that the thing we've got to ensure across the board, not just to do with steel reuse, is that those credentials are real rather than just a sort of greenwash, as it were.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to come in on there as well. I think, because I work on quite a few projects where they've got their targets and benchmarks, which I know, it's good to try and sort of have a target to meet at. But I just sometimes we need better benchmarks. The benchmarks aren't always relevant for the project that you're on. And then as soon as you get to the benchmark, sometimes job done. Who's to know that benchmark was right in the first place? And still, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. People focus on recycled content, which really isn't changing anything in the grand scheme of things as well. So there does need to be sort of a better sort of education there, I think.
Yeah, and just intelligence applied to it. Is this really doing the environment?
Yeah, are we
good?
actually making a difference?
Are we making a difference, or are we just making it easier to let? Which, I guess,
and just
has
accounting for accounting's sake.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have had my time call, so the rest of the questions will not disappear. Thank you very much for them. I think, Steve, we can pick them up in the next couple of panel sessions, if that's okay. They certainly seem to lend themselves to moving on to the next session. So I wondered, though, if I may just come to the panellists and thank you very much for all of your insights this morning. Is there anything burning that we haven't talked about that you want to say before we exit the stage? Christian?
Well, I think it was a really good discussion, to be honest, and I think Steve did a great job in creating that table where everybody can sit around and talk about the adoption of circular economy principles in steel. It's a big deal. It drives a lot of the impact of the buildings, even though maybe impact is not the main lever. Maybe one other thing that hasn't been addressed is on the sort of the shadow side of this becoming more and more popular. There also is this risk that, you know, reused steel is going to be more expensive than new steel, which also lends maybe for some less, how would you say that, people with lower norms and values to then sell new steel as used steel. So I think also tracking and tracing plays a very important element to ensure, to show the provenance in the sort of chain of custody of these elements, that indeed what people are buying is what they're buying. Mm-hmm. We've also, of course, implemented in our passport. Yep. The fun thing about it as well, or I don't know if it's really fun, I find it fun, I guess, is that once you have these passports and tracking and tracing in place, you can actually also insure these products. I guess insurance isn't fun at all, but I just find it something new and sort of exciting. Yep. And it's a big deal, right? Because then you're lowering the risk, and by lowering the risk, maybe the adoption rate would go up.
Absolutely. Thank you. Katherine?
I think for me, it's how you incentivise the demolition contractor or the building owner when there isn't that carbon target there, and it is difficult to get them to do things differently. The demolition contractor isn't really going to get any sort of, you know, they may get better financial, they may get marketability, that sort of thing, but they're not gaining anything carbon-wise. They're not really ticking that box. So it's really sort of finding ways that, you know, in how they work now, we can sort of just, it works in how they work now rather than doing things completely differently, because we know that's not going to happen. And, you know, that we need to create more reused steel, so it's really, really important.
Yeah. Fantastic. Andy? There's no pressure.
No, mine's fairly simple. It's just to be ambitious and talk to people and push things forward and think that we can do this and move reuse the steel forward, and not take sort of the easier option of, oh, a client said no, let's not. Let's go for it. Let's can be done. Push the industry forward.
Fantastic, thank you. And last but by no means least, of course, Simon.
Well, I agree with what Andy just said, and on that subject, there is in some quarters, I doubt in this room, but you know, just kind of, oh, it's too difficult, oh, it's too risky, oh, we've never done it like this, we haven't done it before. What I always say to people is we've been reusing steel for decades and decades and decades. Every time we repurpose a building, 318 Oxford Street, we're reusing all, you know, 80% of the steel. We're just not moving it. And actually, if you move it somewhere else, why is that different? And that was the basis on which we approached the reuse before the protocols were published. So it's not this big scary thing that we've never done before and we don't know how to do and creates lots and lots of risk. It's just what we do, but it's the kind of logical next step.
Fantastic. So there we have it. Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you ever so much for the questions from the floor. And I do believe it's coffee time.